Arizona is home to 22 tribal nations and more than 340,000 Native Americans. Arizona State University builds on more than 6 decades of working and partnering with tribal nations and communities. Many of our Native faculty incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems in seeking solutions through a process of community engagement that respects and honors traditional ways of thinking. Together, we are creating community solutions leading to a more equitable future.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. Montana's Democratic Party is formalizing a role in the party specifically for Native Americans. According to the Great Falls Tribune, it's the first state party in the country to establish such a role, and it's based on Native population. Representatives from Montana's 8 tribes will now have 2 delegates each in the party's platform, rules, officers, and special nominating convention. And this means they can help choose party leaders, candidates for special elections, and the contents of the party platform. Representative Donovan Hawk is a citizen of the Crow tribe. He advocated for the rule change and says it's about improving health care, infrastructure, and the economy for American Indians in the state. Some of the Democratic tribal committees are already forming. Maria Vega was selected as chair of the Fort Peck Tribal Committee, with Lance Forstar selected as vice chair. David Sorrell was selected to chair the Flathead Tribal Committee. Patrick Yawiki Peltier will serve as the vice chair. Yawiki Peltier says he hopes the new party role will help engage more Natives to vote. The Democratic Party already knows the Native vote can swing elections. They point to the 2018 election of Senator John Tester, and before that, Steve Bullock's victory in 2016. Both candidates won by less than 20,000 votes, which is within the margin of the Native vote. In an effort to reclaim and maintain tribal identity, Indigenous languages are being revitalized in Wisconsin. Rosa Francoeur, who is Oneida, is helping re-energize languages in the state. She told the Green Bay Press-Gazette that phrases and sentences in her language reinforce an Indigenous way of thinking and looking at the world. In the Oneida culture, the emphasis is on the actions of a person, what's being done, as opposed to the English structure of language, where the focus is on the subject. Francoeur comes from the band of Oneida people that today lives in Wisconsin. The other bands are located in New York and Canada. Now the Oneida Nation is bridging the language gap locally and internationally. The Oneida citizens voted on creating a comprehensive plan linking all the Oneida language programs together. Francoeur says the Oneida in Canada have more proficient speakers, and some are helping their Wisconsin relatives relearn the language. She says they are still in the process of putting together the language program. The Canadian government's National Action Plan responding to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women is falling short. That's according to several First Nations people. The report includes short-term priorities like public education campaigns and community-led healing programs. However, it has been criticized for a lack of details about how the plan will be implemented and the associated costs. Lynn Crew is Métis. She's the CEO for the National Women's Association of Canada. Her organization was working with the government on its response to the national inquiry, but announced they would be stepping away. Crew's organization is releasing its own plan. She explains the differences between them.
So what does ours look like as opposed to the government's? Well, ours does have a section in the back of our document that clearly states what is the initiative we're doing, how much it costs, who is responsible within our organization to do that, and how we're actually going to achieve that.
The group's plan involves more than 65 steps that relate to areas such as culture, health, justice, and public awareness. Jared Tate is a musician and a composer who is blending traditional and modern cultures on stage. He's been composing for nearly 30 years. Karina Domingos talked to him about his most ambitious album that was just released.
Jared and Pichataha Tate is mixing traditionally native sounds and language with modern symphonic music. His latest album is Lowak Shapala, which means fire and light in Chickasaw. The American Composers Forum suggested Tate partner with the Chickasaw Nation to compose the album.
It was a blast. I had so much fun, and everybody involved really had a great time.
The body of work merges modern classical music with theater and features an orchestra, the Chickasaw Children's Chorus, dancers, and narrators. It premiered in a live performance on the Chickasaw Nation in 2009. After that, Governor Bill Anatubby approved a full professional recording with a Grammy Award-winning label.
It was incredible how well it came together, and I was just so proud of my community.
It was 10 plus years in the making because each element needed to be recorded individually and layered into the final mix.
It was as difficult as I had anticipated, and I was ready for it.
It's been played by several major symphonic orchestras, like the San Francisco Symphony.
That to me is success, is when I'm able to bring my tribal members into these projects and we can all as a group achieve something that's very historically significant. It feels really good to do that.
He's currently composing a full-length opera sung in the Chickasaw language about the tribe's shell shaking and stomp dancing, which Tate says is the tribe's signature sound. Karina Dominguez, Indian Country Today.
And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Rick West has called his career a double rainbow. We'll hear from the man who opened the National Museum of the American Indians and is now leaving the Autry Museum.
And John Tasuda gives us a Beltway update on a new policy that impacts Indian country. Rick West has been leading the Autry Museum for the last 9 years as its president and its CEO. Now he's retiring. He's also the founding director of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he served as director from 1990 to 2007. He's an attorney and a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma. Welcome, Rick, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Gene Autry and his wife Jackie started the museum, and it's really an interesting story. Maybe start with that.
Well, it is. And of course, Gene Autry is my fellow Oklahoman. Much of his family was located in Oklahoma, North Texas, down in Chickasaw country, as I recall. And so there's that kind of connection. And then I had a connection fairly early on, before I actually came out here to be the director, because when they merged the Southwest Museum of the American Indian into the Autry in 2003, the director then set up a special Native Council, and I served as part of that council, got to know Jackie much better. Gene, unfortunately, was already gone by then, but my ties to the Autry go back even before my tenure as its president and CEO, and it's quite a remarkable place.
Well, and as a museum, and it's an extraordinary place, but I think one of the most amazing things that you did in your tenure was to change the narrative of Native people with the play series, and to bring in authors and to give them a platform and basically say there's some really good stuff out there to a larger audience.
Well, I certainly do agree with that, and I hope that that's what we were able to do. You refer to one of our lead favorite programs of mine, Native Voices, a Native theater program that sits with the Autry. And I liked it so much that you may not remember, but when I was the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, I actually tried to bring that program to the NMAI. And the artistic director and leaders of the Native Theater's operation at that point said, well, Washington, D.C., living near San Diego, I think we'll stay on the West Coast. And so that's how it came to be with the Autry Museum of the American West. So in a way, I followed it rather than it following me. But it's a great addition. And you're correct. While I have been here, we have attempted to strengthen, if you will, all of the museum that relates to the Native side of its collections and staff. And that has included doing more things with the collection after it has been finally merged completely into the Autry, and hiring staff to support it in the form of Joe Horsecapture, for example, who is now a vice president for Native collections. And so we've been able to beef things up in that respect quite steadily.
During your career, you've witnessed and in most cases led a real change in how museums think about Native people. Maybe talk about that for a minute.
Surely. Well, it begins, of course, at the NMAI, but it then goes on to the Autry. I think that is an accurate description of the aspirations and the achievements, quite frankly, of the National Museum of the American Indian. It had a three-part mission adopted by the Board of Trustees of the NMAI when I arrived there. And it was first that we make sure that Native voice as a first-person voice was invoked, if you will, readily and steadily in our galleries as an interpretive voice. That was one of the first parts of the strategic plan, of the mission statement of it. Second, that we make sure that Native cultures were looked at, interpreted, and represented as living cultures and not some ethnographic remnant preparing to fall off the stage of history. That was the second part. The third part was that our collections and our human expertise would somehow be brought to Native communities more directly, loans of collection, support of community cultural institutions and museums in Native communities, that kind of thing. So yes, I think that was a different way of doing business at that time. We weren't the only ones doing it, but we were certainly the largest institution doing it at that time. And of course, that legacy I brought with me also to the Autry Museum of the American West, where we have attempted to do exactly the same kind of thing. And interestingly enough, the Resources Center here at the Autry Museum is modeled in many ways after the Cultural Resources Center at the National Museum of the American Indian. Staff from the Autry literally went to Washington to visit the Cultural Resources Center of the NMAI to see how things were done there, to try to make sure we could try to do the same kind of thing out here. And it's been largely successful, I'm happy to say.
I know we live in a world where we measure everything. So when you measure the visitor experience, what do people come away with?
We want them to come, we know what they come with in many respects. You need to know both. You need to know what people come into the museum with in their perception, for example, of Native cultures and other cultural communities, because we represent a variety of cultural communities that make up the American West and certainly make up LA. So you need to know that. And then you need to figure out what experience and what narrative you're trying to construct that may change some of their perceptions or challenge some of their perceptions of Native people. And so to use the Native collections and Native exhibits as an example, I think it again is to let people know for sure that Native people are alive and well, have a potent legacy, especially here in California, a legacy that they retained only against the greatest of challenges. When you think that in a 15-year period, there was a demographic collapse of Native people of almost 75% in California, which is devastating. And so they've had a lot to fight off and recover from. And we just want to make sure that people understand all aspects of that story. But most of all, I want people to understand that Native communities and Native peoples are proud of their survivance. And I distinguish that from the word survival. Survival means you sort of lasted through it. Survivance means that you met the challenge and you ended up triumphing over it.
One of the stories that you tell at the Autry that I saw immediately in love is the idea of an urban people. And the West is the most urban part of the United States. And when you say that, people don't immediately, they push back and say, how could that be? It's wide open spaces. But because of those wide open spaces, it's urban. And one part of that story is that tribal communities have been urban for a long time too.
Oh, absolutely. And indeed, you know, that is attributable, you might remember, to one of the chapters, which is not particularly one of our favorites in Indian history, of relocation back in the 50s and late 50s and early 60s. But two of the centers for relocation were in California, both San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so the population, the Native population in the urban areas of Los Angeles is, I think, the largest urban Native population in the United States, with the possible exception of Chicago, I think. But it is a large Native population, and it's a population with which the Autry has striven always to have a very, very close connection, both through the old Southwest Museum of the American Indian, and now that the Southwest Museum collection is at the Autry, and there's lots of programming going on there. We have a very hearty relationship with the urban Native community here in LA, which has lots of different parts. I mean, the Indian Chamber of Commerce has a chapter or is headquartered here in Los Angeles. There are lots of groups relating to the industry, to the entertainment industry that are here. Native Voices is here. There's a very diverse urban Native community here. And we want to make sure that we speak to that as well as the balance of the Native community, which is not so situate.
The other survivant would be the California tribes and some of the really remarkable things they're doing. How is that reflected in the museum story?
Well, we try to do it rather directly, quite honestly. There is an entire section of the museum that is called California Continued. And that is comprised of a set of 2 different exhibition areas and the ethnobotanical garden. It was underwritten with funds from the state of California, actually, and it had 2 requirements. First of all, that you speak to environmental and ecological issues, and that it begin with a Native viewpoint, that it invoke Native voice in addressing those subjects. And so we have done that. And one of the most stunning exhibits that came out of that, which I shall never forget, especially because we lost him in COVID, was Marshall McKay and the exhibit about the family that raised him, Mabel McKay, who was an exquisite basket maker. I think probably the best of them all in some respects, highly respected. And the exhibit was about her, about California, about the challenges here, the challenges overcome. Mabel McKay was a teacher, a religious leader, an educator, a student. She carried many, many hats and wore them all magnificently. And in California, you're correct. The story of the survivance of California tribes is really, really, truly remarkable, because in a way, we all got the backhand of certain forces in Indian country. But California suffered most in many respects, and most immediately in the shortest period of time.
I want to end with a last question about legacy. And I'll never forget, speaking of that, the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian and just the gathering on the mall and how powerful a statement was that. What's your big takeaway from your experience with NMAI?
My big takeaway from the experience at the NMAI is that it was a blessing. It established our place on the National Mall. It changed the narrative of how we think of Indians, both past and present. And it sits right at the bottom of Capitol Hill, looking them square in the jaw. And I don't want Congress and the people who sit up in that big building to ever forget that we're looking up at them all the time. And I was proud of that achievement for that reason. It was a turning point in history that I will always remember.
Rick West, and Congress will remember as well. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
We'll be right back with a look at the latest Supreme Court ruling on tribal jurisdiction. John Tsuda III is a regular contributor to Indian Country Today. He's worked as the staff director for the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and he is also former principal deputy assistant secretary for Indian Affairs. Today, he is a partner with Navigators Global, which is a company that provides political services to several industries, including tribes. John Tsuda joins us today to talk about policy and the impact on Indian country. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Mark. It's always good to talk with you.
So the Supreme Court weighed in on the complex issue of jurisdiction, and it was a big deal.
A big deal for Indian country. And I think, probably surpassed some expectations. We rarely get a 9-0 decision. So, I think that, this issue of the authority to stop potential criminals on the road and being able to hold them is a really big deal, because there's often no other law enforcement on public roads. in Indian country. And so it was a really big deal, calling that into question. And the Ninth Circuit really kind of went down a rabbit hole with this. And I think some people were puzzled that they went the direction they did. But, the Ninth, when the Supreme Court, issues a 9-0 decision that really puts an issue to rest, there's kind of nowhere else for it to go. So that was a great outcome for tribes and for tribal jurisdiction.
Well, this was the Cooley decision, and it involved Montana. And the Crow Reservation, one of the areas is where distances are often great. And so tribal, as you mentioned, tribal jurisdiction is it for a long, long time in many cases.
Right. They're often the only law enforcement out there. And, it's a challenge for our tribal law enforcement because they also are understaffed in almost every reservation. And so they're often out there alone. And every time that there is a question about how they conduct their activities, that makes it more and more difficult for them to do their basic job of public safety. So again, this is a great outcome for tribal law enforcement and for tribal jurisdiction.
One of the reasons we're even in this space is because the Congress has not really had clarity about policy over different eras. And so much of the jurisdictional confusion comes out of the era when termination and other policies were in practice. Now in this era of self-determination, is this far enough, or does this move the needle in terms of where tribes need to go in terms of government?
Well, I think it's certainly a good building block. And again, there was an assumption, I think, by a lot of folks, including the U.S. Department of Justice, that tribal police actually had this authority to at least temporarily detain suspicious individuals and hold them, if they weren't Indian, hold them for non-tribal law enforcement to come and take custody of them. So, like I said, in the beginning, it was a little bit of a surprise that the Ninth Circuit went so far down the rabbit hole on this. But I think that again, it lays the issue to rest, and we look forward to the next one, which maybe will be a building block for greater recognition of tribal courts. You talk about the different circumstances and different policies that have happened over time. It would be great to get more clarity for public safety in Indian country.
Well, and when you look back at Public Law 280 and some of the others that inspired this division, tribal law enforcement wasn't nearly as professional, meeting post standards and other areas as they are now. And even just looking at the issue again from a policy standpoint, ought to come up with some different conclusions. I think one of the areas that really strikes me is how closely tribal law enforcement often works with state and county officials.
Great point. Really, it's has become a necessary part of law enforcement in Indian country, is the cooperation with local and state law enforcement. And I thought that in the Supreme Court's decision, actually a very important piece in dicta, but it still, I think, will carry some weight. There was some very supportive discussion about tribal and state and local cross-deputization agreements, and pointing to those as one answer to getting around some of these troubling jurisdictional issues that come up on the reservation.
Having both had matters before state courts and tribal courts, I can tell you tribal courts are usually more efficient. There could be a lot of areas for growth just for that reason, if nothing else.
And I hope that this will also continue a trend that we've seen, in recent years, of providing more resources for law enforcement in general. And I would include tribal courts in that. As you noted, tribal police have become more professional. The BIA police have been able to get more resources to assist in training, et cetera, with tribal police. And so, that I think has made a very positive difference for tribes in trying to establish their law enforcement in their courts.
There's a notion that was in the Senate and certainly was kind of a cloud with this Supreme Court review, is that there's somehow unprofessionalism for Indian police or courts in arresting non-Indians. And that really hasn't borne out by any of the data. And I'm just curious, is this a recognition by the court that you're safe, it's okay to our non-Indian colleagues?
Well, I would like to think so. And hopefully, these things often sort of go in trends, but it does seem to be going in the right direction. Again, a 9-0 decision is a very strong statement in support of tribal police and tribal jurisdiction, stopping a non-Indian individual on the road. So, that's great, and we hope that this trend and support of tribal police continues, and a recognition, as you said, of the professionalism that we brought to tribal police. And if you look across jurisdictions, I think that tribal police are as professional or more than many local and state police forces across the country. And they do their jobs well. Like I said, they're often understaffed and under-resourced, but they're very committed, and they work great with their communities. They're very, very tied in, and they provide the type of law enforcement that everybody in the country is looking for right now, so that they have contacts, within the community to help provide better public safety. I think tribal law enforcement is leading on that.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Join us again tomorrow and online at IndianCountryToday.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing Rock. This is Indian Country Today.